Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Hi. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and read a welcome, and then I'm going to invite Akba to come up to introduce Charles Jensen, our speaker today. So we welcome to this year's Tabula Poetica Reading Series. Please take a moment now to silence your cell phone. As we have in the past, we will continue to record these events and make the videos available on YouTube at the conclusion of this series. In addition to today's events, Tabula Poetica and the Creative Writing Program will be hosting the MFA reading on December 10th. And actually, if you're interested in reading, you could see me or Jean after this event concludes. I'm reading from a script, which I'm not used to. Tabula Poetica this year is sponsored by the English Department and the Dean's Office of Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Whenever you enjoy a literature event, whether it's this one or another, I encourage you to read the author's book, and we're happy to have made Charles Jensen's book available to several classes. And if you come to the 4 p.m. event as well later today in AF 209A, the first 5 students to show up will get a free copy of one of his books. So please come. Thank you for joining us today as well for Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences signature initiative, Engaging the World, Leading the Conversation. Each year, the college selects a key social issue to examine through interdisciplinary, campus-wide conversations to promote thoughtful dialogue, mindful reflection, awareness, and empathy. The 2024 series focuses on the topics of gender and sexuality. Over the fall semester, we are drawing on the wide-ranging expertise of our faculty and invited speakers to engage in a multidisciplinary discussion of how the social constructs of gender and sexuality shape our lives, our culture, politics, past, present, and future. This series will explore the evolution and impact of cultural, community, and legal conceptions of gender and sexuality, along with resistance and activism countering gender inequality, community exclusion, and sexual and gender-based violence. We encourage students interested in exploring these issues past this semester to look at the Women's and Gender Studies and LGBTQ Studies minors housed in Wilkinson College. We would like to begin by extending special thanks to Karen Wilkinson and Reg Lancaster for their sponsorship of ETW. Karen is the daughter of Harmon Wilkinson, the namesake of Wilkinson College. Before welcoming up Akba to introduce Charles, I want to remind the audience of the next ETW event, our final program for this semester. Please join us in the Foligno Theater at 7:15 p.m. on Thursday, December 5th, for a panel discussion titled Juggling Gender, Perspectives on the Ever-Changing Gender Landscape. This will be a multidisciplinary discussion around today's ever-changing landscape of gender identity. Professor Laura Glenn will discuss challenges and opportunities around the assessment of gender identity and developmental psychological research. Professor C.K. Magnolia will share her views on the trans-panic strategy in U.S. politics 2018 to 2024. And Professor Sally Rubin will share their groundbreaking animated documentary, Mama Has a Mustache. The panel is also joined by Chapman University alum Addison Rose Vincent, who will share their expertise as an LGBTQ+ advocate, consultant, influencer, and founder of Break the Binary LLC. We hope to see you there. And now thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Akba.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Can you hear me now? Yes. Great. Thank you for coming out today. I'm someone who is enjoyed reading Charles Jensen's poetry while being an undergraduate, and it's been a wonderful moment for me to be here to be the one doing the introduction. Emma, my colleague, and I have wondered about the right way to talk about Jensen without overdoing it. And here's one thing we have learned. It is easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle than for one to find the right words to talk about the person whose work they admire. And like I already said, I admire Jensen's work very much, and I know you will. Here is also something we know. Charles Jensen was born in Eagle, Wisconsin, and earned an MFA from Arizona State University. His full-length poetry collection, First Risk 2009, was a finalist for the 2010 Lambda Literary Award. He's also the author of the chapbooks The Strange Case of Maribel Dixon 2007, Living Things 2006, winner of the Frank O'Hara Chapbook Award, and Later Born in Eden's 2005. The City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs designated him a 2019-2020 Cultural Trailblazer, and his honors include the 2018 Zocalo Poetry Prize and a Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Prize. So many of you here who are poets would want to submit your work next year for this prize. Thank you. The poems in Jensen's The First Risk are influenced by a variety of subjects, including art, film, and mythology. Over 4 extended sequences, Jensen writes of the murder of Matthew Shepard, the films of Pedro Almodovar and Alfred Hitchcock, the painter Luca Cambiasa, and the myth of Venus and Adonis. His most recent books are Instructions Between Takeoff and Landing, published 2022, and Splice of Life, a memoir in 13 film genres, 2024, which most of you have here. These books are exploration of queer identity, race, and personal history. For its innovations, the poetry collection, we have you taking quizzes to question everything you think you know, which I believe is the reason we are here. I mean, you have all of these little papers on your chest you've already picked while we listen to him. To quote Richard Dyer, the author of White, it's important as you read Jensen's work to see that he's talked about whiteness as a race. It's important we have to examine all of this as we run the risk of seeing whiteness as a default color and every other person racialized. His poems have broken me and they have mended me. I hope they break you too and heal you. Thank you. Let's welcome him.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And also thanks to Chapman for having me and Julia and Anna for being amazing hosts. I'm here obviously to talk about a topic called the queer subject, voice, memory, and identity. So I'll start by saying, let me confirm for you that I am a queer person. And that's why I want to talk about this. When I started writing, there was a lot of discussion among queer writers, whether we were queer writers or writers who happen to be queer. And I've always identified as a queer writer. I understand why people want to make this distinction or have that dialogue, but for me it was never really a question. And that's partly because I think queerness has shaped everything about how I've experienced my life and the world around me. So it's very important that I own it and I make it a prime part of how I move through the world. I can certainly empathize with people who are outside of this identity, but for me, it shapes how I come to the page. And on that note, how many people in here consider yourselves writers? Okay, be proud about it. And how many of you are poets? Okay, let me start by saying that I think genre is a construct and it's fake. So I believe that whatever I write is whatever I'm going to write, and that someone else has to categorize it later. That's not my problem. That's a bookstore problem. But as I'm creating, I leave myself open to being inspired by fiction, nonfiction, poetry, regardless of what I'm writing. Okay, so we're going to talk about craft today, and it is going to focus on poetry. I do think these ideas will transfer to other genres as well, but I'm going to get really nerdy about poems. Okay, so prepare yourself. I want to start with some key understandings that I have for myself about poetry. and I hope that they are meaningful to you as well. But basically, I think poems have three vectors. And there are three aspects of the poem that exist in every single poem and that are generally within the poet's control, and they shape the final product. So they are occasion, content, and form. So I'll talk a little bit about what these mean. So when I say occasion, I mean the reason or condition around the creation of the poem. This includes what prompted the poem to be written, who the speaker of the poem is, and the context in which that poem exists, the time it's written, other people who are writing about similar subjects. All of that is part of occasion. You can think of it this way. When you're at a poetry reading and the poet starts off their reading by telling you a little story about where the poem came from or why they wrote it or what they were thinking about, that's the occasion of the poem. And while it's not always present when we're reading the work, it is present within the work. It cannot be separated from that work. Poems can be inspired by other poems, so you might see a poem that has a note under the title that says after Charles Jensen, if it was something that I wrote that prompted it, or they may include an epigraph, which is a quote from the poem, which also helps you establish the occasion for it. I think the occasion of the poem also includes the identity of the speaker in the poem, because that is a really core decision that's made early in the writing process. So sometimes that speaker is the poet. Sometimes we say, it's not me, but it's someone really similar to me. And sometimes it's a persona that we've chosen to write in. One way I think that we can think about the impact of these three vectors is what would happen if we cranked it all the way up to 11, like past 10 on the app. What would it sound like? And so an occasion, a poem where occasion is the most significant part of the poem is going to be something that was written to honor an event, like an elegy, an epithamalion. Did I say that right? It's the hardest word to pronounce in poetry. That is a poem that is written for a wedding. There is a name for that. In its worst case scenario, I think that an occasion turned all the way up in a poem is a greeting card, where we're giving it to commemorate the occasion more than to convey the message of the poem. Okay, so these things, they can be modulated in every piece. I wrote a craft essay about occasion, and it was an American Poetry Review earlier this year. If you're interested in reading it, you can learn more about those ideas. I use content to describe everything that is within the poem. And so this sounds like a really big category. And you're like, this is way bigger than occasion. What are you doing? It is a lot. This is diction, so the choice of words, syntax, the order those words are in, semantics, what emotions we associate with the meanings of those words. I put figurative language here, so all your similes, all your metaphors, images, and I even put rhetoric here. So if you're familiar with the poems of Louise Glick, I think that she is a really remarkable poet of rhetoric, and a lot of the epiphany that's developed in her pieces come out of building an argument. So if you ever have read the book Meadowlands, I would highly recommend. It's amazing. And there are a lot of poems of rhetoric in that book. So while occasion sparks the poem, the content is the body of the poem. I'm going to touch a little bit about content when we talk about poems in this talk, but I want to make clear that a poem doesn't need to have queer content to be queer. And that's a distinction that I'm going to keep coming back to and dive a little bit deeper into as we talk. So just to keep it simple, content is the literal part of the poem you are reading. And I think when content gets dialed all the way up, we have shapeless prose. No offense to the prose writers in the room. But poetry is really shaped language. So if we're taking that shape away, what do we have left? Just language, right? Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about form. And for me, form is a very broad topic. I don't just think about form in the traditional sense of like, here's a rhyme scheme, here's a meter. I really think of it including all of the negative space around the poem on the page. Because when we're looking at the poem, when we're reading it, that has meaning to us. If there are gaps in the lines, that's meaningful. So what that meaning contributes to the poem is something that we contend with as readers. So I do include organizing principles in this idea, like meter, like rhyming, syllabics, the use of refrains or repeated lines, but also like what presence does that white space have as I read the poem? Is there a lot of space between stanzas, for example? That makes us slow down and be more meditative when we read the poem. I also think about the margin and indents from the margin. That's going to be a topic I come back to a couple times today. I consider traditional forms to be the representation of what happens when you dial form all the way up. And that's partly because, like, how many people in here have written a sonnet before? Okay, sonnets are really bossy. And they almost determine what you're going to write before you've even written it in a line. That's because they have such strict requirements to them. I also think that maybe we could think of nursery rhymes as like the most extreme aspect of form, because a nursery rhyme, that rhyme and meter overtakes all of the content. And we all know the rhyme of a nursery rhyme, the meter of it, the rhythm of it. It's like intrinsic to us after a while. It's also what Emily Dickinson used in all of her poems. Very similar kind of rhyme scheme. So I think form is one of the least discussed aspects of work, and particularly when a poem doesn't have traditional form or is in an innovative form. I think we only contend with it when it's traditional, has repeating elements that we can identify as structural guidelines for the poem. I think of that as sort of like a scaffolding for the poem. But form is so much bigger than that for me. And if we're not making every consideration about form when we write our poems, I don't think we're doing all the work we need to do as poets, because whether you are doing it consciously or not, you've made decisions about form. Every time you've written, when you break a line, when you make a stanza break, all of that is a consideration that is formal in nature. So these three vectors are never equal, I would say. Or it'd be very, very rare for them to be equal in a poem. And I think as poets, we have one that we naturally gravitate toward. Definitely form. If you've read my book, form is top of mind for me a lot of the time when I'm writing. It's definitely a comfort zone. I don't think all poems always spring from a clear occasion either. So I don't know that occasion always comes first, even though I kind of described it that way. I think sometimes you can decide to write a villanelle. And so now that form is really the prompt that has inspired you to write the poem. Or you have an image in mind, and you really want to capture that image in your poem. So that is kind of the occasion and the prompt for you. But as you write, the occasion, the reason why that poem exists, and the context in which it exists are still part of that poem, whether you started there or not. And I don't think these can be separated from each other. So when I was thinking about the talk, I had an idea, because I had given these three ideas of voice, memory, and identity before I thought really detailed about what I wanted to say today. But I think that there's a fun relationship between those ideas and what I just talked about. So when we think about this, you know, a queer voice is part of occasion. It's part of what prompts what we write. It's the delivery message, or the way that we deliver the message of the work we're writing. For content, all of our content is shaped by memory. Even if we're imagining a future, our imagination is bound only by the things we believe are possible or conceivable, right? And that's all been shaped by your lived experience, what you've seen, felt, heard, tasted, all of that. And that's also, for example, what shapes my queer identity is memory. Who I have been has determined who I am today, and that will help determine who I become tomorrow in the future. And all of that factors into what and how I write. So form then, I think, is identity. And just like with form, I talked about how it was organization within the poem and organization outside the poem. I think our identities work the same way. So my internal identity, of course, is a queer person, and that's not visible, generally speaking, unless I am making explicit choices to make it visible to people around me. On the other hand, I have an identity that is defined from the outside in, which is what people see when they look at me, a middle-aged white man. Unfortunately for me, that is also the profile of most American serial killers. But I am not one, right? And that's partly because I have this internal identity that's not necessarily consistent or always in alignment with my external identity. But I have to be aware of both, because how I move through the world and how I'm perceived is just as important to me as how I build and construct myself in this world. So there are two ways that I think we can think about the word queer, and I'm going to dive into both today. One is obviously a lived identity that is very inclusive, but I think queerness is also an ideology. That took me to this quote from Bell Hooks, where she is interpreting and developing queer theory by people like Tim Dean. So she says, as the essence of queer, I think of Tim Dean's work on being queer. And queer not as being about who you're having sex with, that can be a dimension of it, but queer as being about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. Okay, so in this statement, I see voice, memory, and identity all articulated by bell hooks. And if we start paring the statement down, this is what I want to focus a little bit more intently on. A summation of the complexity of queer identity that it turns into an ideology. It's not just an identity, that's part of it, but it's a way of living, and it's a way of living that's been shaped by the rest of the world. And then I landed here. And this is something that really surprised me when I started thinking about bell hooks' quote, but I also like that it looks like those t-shirts with all the ands on them. The self has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. And so when I think about what queer means as an ideology, that is really what I'm going to carry forward through the rest of this talk. Queerness requires invention. Okay, so for the sake of both depth and brevity, I'm going to stick close to form for the rest of this talk, and that's because I think form is so intrinsically linked to the idea of identity. I want to look at some examples of queer writing that I think invents formal considerations that are reflected of the invented self and the invented voice. And so remember, we're thinking of queerness as being at odds with the world around us, that we must invent a place where we can speak and live and thrive. Okay, so keep that close in mind. I covered up the F word here because I just wasn't really sure how we were feeling about it. It is on your paper if you need to see it for yourself. You can probably guess which F word it is. This is from Carmen Maria Machado's memoir, In the Dream House, which is a book that kind of changed my life and thought about, what is a memoir and how do we exist in a context of bigger ideas, right? So in this book, she talks about the idea of a dream house as being the place where her love can finally thrive and be welcomed. But that dream house becomes kind of a nightmare over the course of the book because the relationship in question is abusive. My partner is a Barbie designer at Mattel, so I'm very familiar with the importance of a dream house and what it means to people. And I think that's reflected here in Machado's work as well. So here she's saying in the title of this chapter, the dream house has famous last words. We can fuck, she says, but we can't fall in love. And then there's a footnote. The footnote says, Stith Thompson, Motif Index of Folk Literature, a classification of narrative elements in folk tales, ballads, myths, fables, medieval romances, exempla, fablio, jest books, and local legends, Bloomington, Indiana University Press, 1955 to 1958, Type T3, Omens and Love Affairs. So the first thing that may seem a little weird about this is that there's a memoir that has an academic footnote to it, because our lives are generally not part of academic research, and they're not supported by academic research. But here she's trying to make this connection. So we get formally very recognizable elements: title, body, and footnote. As readers, we know how to contend with all of these things. We understand that the footnote is offering either a reference to or additional detail on where the number 2 is. And there is conventional dialogue represented here. There's a character, which is just she. We intuit that that is not Machado, but maybe another character in the book. And we have a simile up at the top here. Because we are reading this in the context of what a memoir is, and the only thing we get is this one quotation, we can intuit that this is a deeply meaningful sentence to the writer. This is a moment. It's a moment that is so important, it occupies a full chapter. Normally we would expect 3,000 to 5,000 words there, but instead we get about 10. And I think also it is meaningful to say, and we'll see this again a couple times throughout these poems, that there is a split between the body and the mind. So what the body desires can be separate from what the mind wants, okay? And I want to just park that in your brains for a little bit. I think similes are really queer. I can't really say more than that about it, but just trust me on it. Because I think in some ways it's something masquerading as something else. or hiding behind the idea of something else, and that can be an element of queer lived experience. I'm going to come back to other things that I think are queer in language too. So the context of the citation at the bottom, this reshapes the quote that we just read. So up here, this is something that we would expect someone to say when dating, like, don't get too attached to me, like, this is not going to be forever. But we can explore each other's bodies if that's what you want to do, that's okay. But then when we think about this and the idea of the dream house in the context of mythology and fables and fairy tales don't hold queer people. They're not containers for our love or desire. In fact, generally speaking, they are the story of how heteronormative love conquers all obstacles, right? But she's saying, like, no, there's something queer about this here. I also thought about Hans Christian Andersen, and I don't know if you know this, but The Little Mermaid is actually a love letter to his best friend who he was in love with and who was a man. And that idea was so unbelievable to him that he turned himself into a literal mythological creature who was a woman to express that love for this other man, right? Like, a mermaid was more believable than queerness. So that's what we're talking about with the fairy tale tradition here. Like, she's truly trying to get in there and queer that idea. And omens and love affairs, of course, that's huge in fairy tales. So here we're intuiting that this is an omen for what's going to happen in this book. I think occupying forms like this is a method by which we queer them. Just like when all of your queer friends show up at the same bar, you make it a queer bar by being there. And so we do that when we show up to forums in literature as well. Like Walt Whitman, I think we contain multitudes, and like I said earlier, genre is fake. Don't believe it, don't buy into it, don't support it. You only take one thing away from today, I want it to be that. Okay, so here's a very short poem. Does someone want to read this aloud for us? Yeah, go ahead.
Dear Williams, the letters between us. Always, when I lay next to you, I think about what lives inside me. Doves flying away from arrows, shooting towards their little white bodies.
Thank you, that's great. Does anyone know what kind of poem this is? Do you recognize a traditional form? Does that help? Okay, this is an abecedarian. Now do you know what it is? Okay. An abecedarian, which is spelled Abecedarin, is a poem where each line starts, oh, I'm sorry, it's not an abecedarian, it's an acrostic. Scratch that, an acrostic. Do we know what an acrostic is?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. What's spelled out at the front of these lines? AIDS. Does that change how you read the poem?
Yeah.
What has it changed for you? Yes.
The occasion,
And what do you mean by that?
the context, I'm thinking about rent, I'm thinking about the vulnerability and the pain, so much more with that context.
Perfect. Yes, thank you for that. If you don't see AIDS on the left-hand margin of this poem, it's just a poem about two lovers who are trying to overcome an obstacle. But now we know what the obstacle is, and I think even more interestingly, it breaks this poem open in such a beautiful way. So now the poem is about two bodies lying next to each other, right, in the bed. But one of the bodies has HIV, and the speaker has anxiety about what AIDS might mean for this affair. And then we get the image of the doves flying away from arrows. Obviously, that's a representation of like the T cell within the body being attacked by the HIV virus, right? But it's a beautiful image. What I think is so brilliant about this poem is the way the word bodies is dropped into the footer, basically. He could have put this at the end of the line, and it would have been a normal acrostic. But he made this artistic choice to take the word bodies, which is deeply meaningful to the entire content of this poem, and he gave it like a shout out by putting it underneath everything else. So we leave this poem and the word bodies is really resonating with us because it's surrounded by all of that white space, right? And it's isolated from the rest of the poem, which I think is a representation of that anxiety that's happening here. This is like one of my favorite shortest poems in the world. I think when I first saw this, I was like blown away by it. I thought, this is amazing. This is so moving, so devastating. So he is queering the acrostic form by making it work for his ends, right? You could call this a broken acrostic, or you could call it just an amazing poem. I think both of those are accurate. I love poems that are broken as well. Yeah, so this is like a queer acrostic. Okay, this is a longer poem. Does anyone want to read this first paragraph out loud? I can also do it. Okay, go ahead.
The whole thing or just the first?
Just the first paragraph.
How can I tell where the paragraph is?
Just what's on the screen. That part.
Okay, got it. Burning a hyphen. Once my mother accused me of throwing alcohol and gasoline on my emotions. Once my father's breath was a guilty verdict. His car curved inward like a palm, how it birthed him back as a fist, and I became the bloody rise of crescent moons hidden inside. I skin my knuckles and smell the alcohol before it enters the wound. Yesterday I read that cleaning a cut with this clear burn will worsen the scar, make the undamaged cells forget how to rebuild. Maybe each scar is the skin's blackout. Each blackout erasure down to the cell. Once my father tried to collision a child into perfect. Once I tried to drink myself into blackout or erasure myself into something more poem than memory. Since the birth of words, we have languaged our history into burnable things, papyrus, paper, plastic film. Once I bought a box of cassettes just to watch their innards burn, flashpoint from wound to wound. Once the cops accused me of lineage, my blood a guilty verdict, each breath my father's. How we first called delirium tremens the blue devils, alcohol possessing the depth in the body. How each drink curls me into a tighter fist, and this too is not mine, or I claim innocence, each bruised wall, each jaundiced dawn without midnight before it, becomes a guilty verdict. My mother marries an alcoholic and gives birth to kindling. This is to say, my father calls his child a faggot and watches them burn. Did I inherit this addiction from my father or the queer of my blood? Once I swallowed liquor like guilt and named this family.
Thank you. All right, is anyone here familiar with a haibun as a form? Awesome. Okay, so a haibun is a traditional Japanese form in which a prose paragraph ends with a haiku. And the haiku is typically an extension of the end of the paragraph, so we might not get like end punctuation on the paragraph before we move into the haiku. It is a beautiful form. Try writing them, they are so fun. So here's the rest of the poem. Can someone else read the last two portions here that have been blacked out? Yes.
Once my mother accused me of my father's breath. His fist hidden inside, I smell the alcohol, forget how to rebuild, each blackout erasure down to birth of burnable things. Once I, just to watch the wound, accuse me of my blood, my father's possessing the body, how each drink too is not mine, or I claim guilt. My mother gives birth to his child, and I inherit this clear of my blood. I swallow and name family. Father, hidden in erasure of me, each drink, mine, my blood.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm obsessed with this poem. I think it is so brilliant. I think, first of all, in the first paragraph we read, we get a lot of content about a queer lived experience that is difficult, and it's difficult in the familial context. We also have a lot of imagery of burning, of accelerants that fuel fire, and there's also commenting on erasure. So the rest of this poem, the practice of erasure comes in and serves as an act of burning. It's burning away what was previously in that longer poem. So this paragraph is actually an edited version of that first paragraph. And then right here, you may be surprised or not surprised to learn that this is the haiku. So the haiku was within the paragraph the entire time. And it just needed to be released through this process of burning away. So this is a poem that's about violence. It's about emotional pain. physical violence, and the act of burning the poem is a violent act against that paragraph. But it arrives at something that I think is liberating for the speaker of this poem. There's an awareness and an understanding of self that they arrive at by the conclusion of this. A lot of the painful stuff has been taken out by the time we get to the haiku, and we're left with just this, this summation. Oh, sorry, here. Okay, there. Queered the form. Okay, so this is a book that changed my life. Charles. Torin is a trans poet. The poem we just read, this is also by a trans poet. And I think what I love about this book is, like, when you look at it, you're like, what is this? Is this Chaucer? Like, how do I even read this? And I think that initial reaction you have is really important to what this poem is designed to do. So I will read it out loud because it's weird. This is from the book called Field. These white skirts and orange sweaters I want in the feeding mart, while my vegetable parts bloom in the common way. A grackle in the garden roost, the tall women washing hands or eyeing turnips, the saddened powers we rub so economically. In one version of things, alarm is my name, unkempt and handled. I am horse. I am saddled. I am a broken horse. This is a poem that when you hear it read aloud, you're like, oh, I get it. But when you look at it, it makes you feel like estranged from your own language. And I love that split. To me, like, this is the closest thing I've ever felt from, like, depersonalized in my own language. And I think that that is the point of this work. It's to make us all feel like language is not intrinsically part of our minds, intrinsically part of our identities, and we have to actually work to get to the meaning. I feel like this poem is a little antagonistic to the reader until you hear it read aloud. I also think that there might be a reference here to something called Polari. So Polari is an invented language that has its origins with, like, carnival folk and thieves, but it became adopted by the queer community as a way for people to speak in front of non-queer people about things that were important to them. And the words are all drawn from Romance languages and from English, but the context and the meanings of those words changes within Polari. So even if you heard it, you'd be really confused about what people were doing. I kind of feel like that is, a spiritual cousin to what's happening here. So I see queer poets using slashes in their lines a lot, and I love that technique. To me, when I read this poem, I'm especially mindful that this is a line that's refusing to be broken, or has been broken and has been restored. But the slash is like the scar of that breakage, right? So the scars, the violence that we incur remains part of us, sometimes visible, sometimes not. I mentioned earlier that similes are queer. Puns are also very queer. They look like one thing and they're meaning something else. I love that. This poem, like I mentioned earlier, it refuses to adhere to the margin. Only the first line touches the margin. And I think this is a rejection of living on the margin as a trans or queer person. And the way that the language looks strange or queered, you really have to hear it aloud to get this poem. Lastly, I love the way this poem ends. It's really heartbreaking to me. But when we talk about the violence of the slashes, we get to this bottom section where the speaker says that they are a horse. Like a wild horse, we would think of something, very free, liberated, living on its own terms, running to its heart's content, living its best life. But when we put a saddle on a horse, it becomes a tool. It becomes a tool of labor in most cases. And the process by which we tame horses is called breaking them, causing violence to them. We break their spirit, actually, so that they become docile and obedient. And this awareness that the speaker is a broken horse, I think, is just really heartbreaking and moving. But it's also a form of violence. Have you ever seen this poem before? Cool. Okay. Do you know who Jericho Brown is? Yes. Great. Okay. He's amazing. So this is a poem in a form that Jericho invented called the duplex form. People have adopted it, and they're starting to write their own duplexes now. The way this form operates is there are couplets, 2-line stanzas throughout the poem. The second line of one stanza becomes the first line of the next stanza, okay? So that repetition is really important. What is a duplex in the non-poetic sense?
Building with like two residents, or like two households living in one building.
Yes. Yeah, typically with one shared wall. It's two houses side by side, typically with a shared wall. So it's one structure, two homes. And of course, that's reflective now of the philosophy of couplets, these two lines that are put together. So each of these stanzas is like a little duplex, right? But when we look deeper at this form, I think it's pretty queer. So first of all, the first two lines are that traditional couplet. But I think there are hidden couplets throughout this poem that represent queerness as an ideology. And it's these mirrored lines that have been separated by the stanza break. But when we hear it aloud, we don't necessarily hear that break. So we're just hearing, I begin with love, hoping to end there. I don't want to leave a messy corpse. I don't want to leave a messy corpse. So that repetition, those two lines looking the same, could be representing the way that a same-sex or same-gender relationship has that shared identity. Again, we see the poem refusing the margin, although it's shifting back and forth. Maybe that margin is sometimes a little comfortable as a place to be, and this poem wants to move away from it. And like in the Machado piece, we have this idea, men who love me are men who miss me. Which you think about that, it's like, I run from people who love me, right? But it's the separation of the body and the mind and desire and love. I'm sorry, we forgot to read this one out loud. I'll do it really quickly now. I begin with love, hoping to end there. I don't want to leave a messy corpse. I don't want to leave a messy corpse full of medicines that turn in the sun. Some of my medicines turn in the sun. Some of us don't need hell to be good. Those who need least need hell to be good. What are the symptoms of your sickness? Here is one symptom of my sickness. Men who love me are men who miss me. Men who leave me are men who miss me. In the dream where I am an island. In the dream where I am an island, I grow green with hope. I'd like to end there. So in this queer couplet down here where I have the box line, men who love me becomes men who leave me in that reflection, right? So again, sorry that these poems are all sad. I didn't do that on purpose. Okay, I think we're doing good on time. All right, does someone want to volunteer to read this poem? Yes, thank you.
She charges her ankle bracelet from the kitchen chair and sunflowers in a white wallpaper begin to wilt. I wilt with them before my sister and her probation officer who comes over to the house unannounced. Just as we are preparing dinner, and what are we supposed to do now? Cook for him? Invite him to eat with us? I am hacking the heads from broccoli stems and pretending his body is spread across the cutting board. Ugh. This officer keeps talking nonsense and nudging his eyes around the apartment looking for drugs, alcohol, alchemy. My sister waits for him to leave and then begins to ramble about her childhood and how she used to be before house arrest. The confines of these plastered walls and her monitored route to work where every corner has a coddling a liquor store. Protecting their notion of freedom, my neighborhood eats fear.
Thank you. So this is an excerpt from a longer poem, and the whole poem is an American Poetry Review. You can read it for free on their website. It's an amazing poem, and it has one of my favorite moments in a poem ever later on. Sorry for not sharing it today, but go seek it out. So in this poem, there are a couple things I want to draw attention to. Again, we see these slashes in the lines, but now instead of getting line breaks, they are stanza breaks. These are more drastic cuts that are being held together. The subject of this poem is the speaker and their sister's home being, invaded by an officer of the law who has come to check on the sister. that is a disruptive presence in their night, and a lot of this poem is about how frustrating it is to have to go through this experience. So I think these slashes are reminders that something is being broken. You know, the sister's ability to leave the house, the peace of their evening. There's a lot of cutting that's happening with the food in the poem. So again, I think that there's more of the slashes later in the poem too. Like the last poem, this poem's resisting the margin in these couplets. So every couplet steps away from the margin, that they can't get away from it because that cop is still in their house. But what this poem is doing that I think is interesting is it's capping the lines in a very traditional way. So old-timey poets and some contemporary poets capitalize the first letter of every line. And we see that less and less now, but here this is coming back. So we see capital letters in the middle of sentences. Can be a little disruptive for us. And what I also love so much about this poem is the use of brackets. So typically, parentheses might be something that's unspoken or something that is just adding context or explanation, but the bracket is something like, it's almost carceral in a way. Like these words are trapped within the prison of these brackets, and they're all things that are unsaid but thought by the speaker of this poem. And my favorite one, of course, is ugh. Like when that comes into the poem, it's like, yeah, we get it. I feel that too. So I also think the slashes are a representation of the rejection of grammar. And the most political thing I'm going to say in this talk today is that I think grammar is a tool of oppression, and I think it's also one of the most effective tools of oppression. How many people have had their punctuation corrected on Facebook or Twitter by someone? Yeah. Did it affect your ability to convey what you were saying because your comma was splicing this? No. Like, no one cares. But people show up to reinforce that because that's a way to have power over other people and to enforce these rules that none of us were involved in making, but we're now beholden to, especially at the academy. Sorry to all the teachers in the room. And this is a poem that is about resistance. It's about resisting this patriarchal power or this, this power that's threatening to destroy the family. I think that's very queer. It's a way to reclaim power. All right, this is the wildest poem I'm going to show you, and we're not going to read it because it is so wild, but I do want to draw your attention to, how do I do this? Right here. This is a poem that has instructions. Rude. Not only do you have to read the poem, but you actually have to cut it out and assemble it into this never-ending shape, okay? And this is how you are supposed to experience this poem. I love it. So obviously you cut these strips out, you tape them as instructed at the tab, and then you twist the poem into this really weird shape. This is a poem that is about a journey, so I'll just read like a snippet. Where a story might begin at a sentence that is not the start, and so whistle and go, Mr. Mistletoe. Penn Station 4 days into a new year. Wave to you north, same train on which I first came. Is this where we began? Mirrored moment of an orange paper, heart thumbed in a pocket. The block to Herald Square, and so the Adirondack 69 slowed that October to curve around Lake Champlain. I learned words like Schenectady through the open pines, Ticonderoga between two waters, Iroquois words chanted to conjure time more than place. So this is a poem about a journey. It's a train journey. And even the content of this poem does not arrive. There is never end-stopped punctuation. It is always these scheduras. And if you're familiar with, like Emily Dickinson poems, the schedura is a very long pause. But here it's also joining all of these pieces of the poem together. So we don't need a full sentence. To me, it kind of approximates that like rhythm of the train chugging along as well. Each sentence is sort of like a little spurt. I think it's a radically queer idea to force people to cut out your poem and tape it together in order to read it the way it's meant to be read. Making non-queer people do work to understand you, that's very queer. And whenever I think a poem subverts the expectation of a poem, that is also very queer. Like we said earlier in this talk, queerness needs to invent a place to live, to speak, and to thrive. So when we show up and we invent our forms, and especially forms that are intricate and complicated and demand attention and focus from people who are reading it, I think that's a way that queer voices make themselves heard. All right, this is my last poem. Can I get a volunteer to read this? I'll say you do not have to read any of the words that are falling out of the line. Yes, go ahead.
We stood on the cliff, dropping the endings of words down to see if they made any noise. Tabitha, you called. I think it was the first you'd spoken hours, days, and you dropped the last word for effect, I suppose. I wouldn't take on the fault. I was never as good at this as you were, but we could spare the letters if you needed something to drop. Letters over the edge, the plants rustled as our words made headway down the hill, towards the twinkling lights of the world below, of the world forgot below. The sound came smaller and smaller until their very last. Hours passed in this way, absorbed in this makeshift gravitational linguistics. We drove to the bottom of the hill and found what we'd spoken in piles. We collected the words we'd left like so much refuse, doused them in the kerosene you spoke, and lit them to keep warm in the winter, hours of the night bay. The fire grew, then I knew your name. It's warmth. I've said it ever since, and I've never known the ice of dissent.
Thank you. Okay, what is this poem about? What happens in the poem? In the narrative. We've got a speaker, we've got a friend. What are they doing? Yeah.
Are we looking at the form of the poem?
The content right now.
Content.
Yeah. So they're dropping words off this cliff. Yeah, thank you. Then what do they do? Yes.
They like go down to the bottom of the cliff and they like light them on fire.
Right. Wild. And the fire keeps them warm. Okay. So this form is, I think this is much more intricate than it might first appear, and the narrative, because it's so clear and it's telling a pretty compelling story about these characters, I think we may forget that the form is so meaningful. So obviously we get these words that are literally falling out of the poem. And the first one that we noticed was missing was world, right? Top of the world is where they are in the beginning of the poem. I didn't circle the EN or B because I think they're really complicated in this poem. I think the EN is the end of forgotten. I think it's also the end of known. So I think it's working in a couple different ways. But we can trace these falling words back to places in the poem. So like asphalt is really what that word is supposed to be, and something. This paragraph is falling apart before it gets to the end. So even though they're dropping words off the cliff, the poem is also dropping those words. In the second paragraph, I think something even weirder is happening, which is there's this chasm opening in the middle of the paragraph. Things are falling through it, but I also think that it's representing the distance that's growing between the speaker and the friend. And that chasm, I think, is actually driven by desire. So what is really meaningful to me in that paragraph is when the speaker says, "Then I knew your name. It's warmth." Oops, sorry. And obviously, the speaker has said the word warmth like 24 times. This person is repeating the name of their friend over and over and over again for comfort. And all of that comfort ends up piled up at the bottom of the poem, not in the body of the friend. So this is a person who I think desires and loves this friend, and they're not connecting, and so they're experiencing separation, and now all of the desire that the person can't say to that person has piled up at the bottom of the poem, so haphazardly. The desire has been deferred from beginning to end. This kind of reminds me of like when you're in high school and you have a crush on someone and you write their name like all over your notebook, just over and over. You're like, oh, that's so beautiful. I just love that name. So warmth is like that notebook for this speaker. Yeah, so I don't know. I just think this is such a wild and interesting poem and a great way to show how form can represent the emotional action that's happening within the poem. This is a process. So, talking a little bit about how this comes about as a poet, I think like you don't necessarily go into the poem with this intent. I think you discover these aspects either in the writing or in revision, and I think that's a totally fine time to bring these elements to it. Once you understand what the poem is trying to do and what it's trying to communicate, you can think about how can I increase that understanding for my reader by shifting the form of the poem. So here, I think if that second paragraph didn't have the gap in it that's widening, I don't know that I would necessarily arrive at the same conclusion that I came to when I read it. It might feel like maybe they are connecting, but I really feel like that gap is so meaningful. That's all I had for you. I'm happy to take any questions or talk about anything more depth.
About the poems or about Charlie's writing life. Anyone have a question? I have one too. So Charlie, as you may know from the introduction and also some of your reading and the reading that's going to happen at 4 o'clock, writes both poetry and nonfiction. So I'm curious, in terms of applying the queering of poetry, how do you think about that similarly or differently in your prose writing?
I still think about form a lot with everything I write. So, the memoir I wrote is a hybrid, a traditional memoir storytelling, and then each chapter has braided into it discussion of a movie that's somehow related because I'm a huge film nerd. And that's kind of how I understand life as I was growing up. That's not a conventional way to write a memoir. To me, when I read that book, the handoff between those sections is really meaningful. So there's an image, a word, a situation that crosses from one paragraph into the next section. Trying to think of what else. I love to write, The Strange Case of Maribel Dixon, which is one of my chapbooks, is told, it's the story of a physicist in the 1930s whose wife disappears. And a graduate researcher, through found documents, reassembles the story through diary entries, shredded documents that they find in his laboratory. I can't remember what the third part is. But they basically discovered that this physicist created a machine that turns the human body into sound, and he sent his wife to a dimension where only sound exists because she was dying of cancer. So you discover that over the course of reading these found documents. It is wild. People actually ask me how I learned about that physicist, and I was like, I made him up in my brain. Like, this is not real. So I feel like I did that convincingly. And then I experiment with fiction too. I wrote a novel about a musical theater production of Jesus Christ Superstar that is produced in Civil War dress with Abraham Lincoln as Jesus. It's a comedy. And each chapter is actually a scene in an act, in a 5-act structure. And at the top of every chapter is a list of the characters who are in that chapter, and they're all through the prism of how the main character feels about those people in that chapter. So she's always like, rising star, and then her best friend is like, unfortunate girl, or whatever, like just a little criticism. Yeah, so thinking about form in really broad ways, like how can I just bring something different to an expected form of storytelling or to writing to make it have more meaning and more interest, and I think more fun for the reader.
Yes, I think if there's one thing I take away from this is, wow, poetry's pretty fun. Any other questions?
I was just going to ask about your process. So if you might tell us.
My process. I like to write in sequence, which if you've read instructions between takeoff and landing, there are like 35 poems in the form of an exam in there. I wrote a lot more of those. So I get an idea, I like to write it over and over and over again until that horse is definitely dead. And then I'll look at what I've done and figure out what are the best examples of this, what can I revise. So recently I've been writing poems in the voices of people who were cursed by the Greek gods, but they're in therapy, telling their therapist about what happened to them. And I did maybe like 9 of those. I'm going to read one later today too. So I don't know, like I try to have an idea and then I just try to execute that idea. So with longer works, I usually look for a structure. I'm working on a memoir that it's about 20 years of singing karaoke. And so each chapter is a specific song I sung and why I sang it. So the subtitle of that book is What I Sang at Karaoke and the Men Who Drove Me to Do It. So it became, I didn't realize this, but it's a book about all the people that I dated or had crushes on over the course of these 20 years. Hopefully they won't track me down after the book comes out. Yeah, that's
All right. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank
Jensen.
you.
Julia. Julia's in the back. Let's give Julia a round of